never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn
Hi,
around.
guys. Welcome back to Neff Inspiration, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stephan Neff. Today, I'm honored to have Willie Handler with me. Willie is a man who was born to Holocaust survivors and has now made it his mission to actually talk about the generational trauma and the plight of the descendants of Holocaust survivors who have been brought up with the fear and the behavioral patterns of their mums and dads and their generation, which has seen a trauma that many of us can't even imagine. 6 million Jews were killed during the Second World War, during the Third Reich, in 12 years, for crying out loud. But anti-Semitism has been around for thousands of years with pogroms through many of the countries. So, and this is no doubt this changes a man and woman to his core when they are exposed to such trauma. And of course, that will have flow-on effects on their children, something that many people don't realize. And this topic could not be more important right now as we're recording that. It is November of 2024, and we see anti-Semitism on the rise throughout the world in such a bizarre fashion that you think, my goodness, can't people just remember back even a few decades when we saw the end results of burned cities, complete countries lying in rubbles as the end result of some mad, extremist, divisive thoughts. So, Willie, I'm very, very grateful to you that you're coming onto my show today. Let's explore those topics from your point of view. Welcome to my show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? It is. I mean, tell me, what was the plight of your mom and dad? Tell us the story, how you can remember it as it was taught to you.
And actually, not a lot was told to me. And in particularly, my father had a lot of difficulty speaking about his experience, which is not unusual. And um, the reasons are A, it was too difficult to speak about, and as well, parents often wanted to protect their children
Mm,
from such really harmful stories. But I can tell you what I do know, and a lot of some of it is a result of a lot of research that I did independently. My father was born in a small village, or was referred to as a shtetl. It was in central Poland. About 2,500 people lived there. 1,500 of them were Jewish. Very typical of vi villages of the time in Poland, where 50% or more were Jewish. Um, he was born in 1912. During the Depression, he was a teen. The family left the little village and moved to a larger city named Benzin for economic reasons and as well because of the amount of anti-Semitism that existed in that village.
mm,
Uh, even though they were the majority.
mm,
And I know of stories because I have acquired a letter from my great grandfather who would write to family members and complain about how the village priest would stand in front of Jewish shops and tell people not to buy from the Jews. So it's incredible, but even when you were the majority, you were still discriminated against or persecuted. So the family moved to a larger town called Benzin, town about 50,000 people, of which about half were Jewish. It was much more open, and there's also an industrial town, so there's a lot of opportunities there.
Mm.
They moved there probably around 1930, um, about a decade before the invasion. Um, when the Germans invaded that town on September 4th, because it's relatively close to the German border, so it was one of the first towns that was invaded. And they did what they typically do in at that time, which was they immediately began persecution and set up rules for the Jews to follow, set up a ghetto, set up a Jewish council. It was during this period my father actually was married. He was married, had two children in the ghetto. Um, in 1942, shortly before they started liquidating the ghetto, he was sent to a labor camp. Um, and what followed was he was moved around to a total of about seven camps before he was liberated in April of 1945. His wife and children in August of 42 were shipped to Auschwitz where they were gassed. That's my father's story. My mother um, is from a tiny village, even smaller village called Comenesti in Romania, um, relatively close to the Ukrainian border. Uh, and a, there was not, even though they were a very small minority, it was like Jews were less than 10% of the village. The relationships were relatively good. And in the 30s, um, fascists took control of the country, as was the case in many European countries following Hitler's rise to power. And in 1940, um, Romanian troops coming back from the border because they had been fighting with Russia, and locals created a pogrom and basically burned down all the Jewish homes, and they were basically expelled to a larger city called Suceava, which still exists. My mother's original village does not exist anymore. Um, and then several months later, they were, no, actually, it was a year later, they were exported, they deported. The entire Jewish population in the region was deported to a region in the Ukraine called Transnistria. It's relatively barren. I sometimes compare it to sort of the killing fields in uh, um, in
Cambodia.
Cambodia.
Mm.
Yeah. And there were some towns that had Jewish ghettos, and they were sent to a Jewish ghetto called Shagarad. There were about 300, maybe 20, 30, 330 dilapidated homes, and 7,000 Jews were housed in those 300 something homes. So my mother tells me she and her family were in a closet with no heat. And so many people died either of starvation or disease. Typhus, there was a typhus outbreak in the first winter. Um, she lost her mother there. They were finally liberated in a March of 1944 by Russian troops. And so they both left at some point for Israel or Palestine. My mother was there, arrived first in 46 illegally. She was detained by the British for a number of weeks and then released. My father was, he didn't immigrate until 48. It was after Israel was declared independent, and so he was there legally. And eventually, in the early 50s, they left and settled in Canada. And that's kind of their story.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. And it's so hard to imagine for us today. We recognize nowadays that if you lose your job, then this is a big kick in the balls, and it's quite traumatic. And if you lose your marriage, if you go through a divorce, well, it can be brutal. Now imagine all that on steroids. Imagine all that happening at the same time. Imagine that everything you hear is actually legal. The Germans imposed more than 2,000 laws against Jews. Okay, it is crazy. So your life was systematically dismantled. The betrayal, the grief, the loss is ongoing. And then imagine that this is becoming more extreme when really people start disappearing. Initially, pretty quietly, and then more and more openly, you know that you will never ever see your family again. Was that knowledge there, or were your mom and well, you said yourself, I'm answering my own question here because you said that your mom and dad never really talked so much about that. They would have not talked about their emotions. They would have not talked about their fears, did they?
Well, particularly with my father, if you began asking him questions,
Hmm,
he would just get visibly upset. Invariably, he would begin to cry.
hmm,
And as a child, you'll learn
of course.
they've been through enough pain. Why am I creating more pain? So you just don't ask.
Correct. Yeah. And that is so difficult because soon that knowledge is gone. And I commend you that you started to become a detective and try to piece together what has occurred in the past. And I think that is our duty that we can document things, especially in the time when there is so much misinformation out there, when there's so much craziness out there that essentially is a repetition of what we have seen 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But nowadays, it's all fueled so much more effectively by means of modern communication. So it is
And
nuts.
yeah, when I decided that when I started my what I would say my investigation, I remember the first time I tried to write my parents' story. It was an 1,800 word blog post. That's the sum of what I knew. And then I basically went on a 2-year mission
Yeah.
to hunt for whatever piece of information I could find. And lo and behold, I now have a 60,000 some odd word memoir that um, in depth describes their experience as well as my own growing up.
Wow. What were some of the behaviors that, with hindsight, you could pinpoint as typical for many Holocaust survivors that influenced your upbringing?
Um, my mother, she suffered from a lot of depression, never treated. At the time, I was too young to be
Mm,
aware that it was depression. Only looking back, I realized, oh my God, she was like so depressed. Um, my father, much more complex. Um, he suffered from a lot of grief. I don't ever think he ever overcame the loss of his first family.
mm,
And I have an interesting story about that, in fact. I will get to in a moment.
mm,
he had a lot of anger, um, huge trust issues. He trusted no one.
Mm.
And so, some of this has been passed on, but a lot of anger, a lot of anger, and sort of illustrate how traumatized my father was. When growing up, we were told he had lost. The one thing that he did tell us over and over again is he lost his wife and daughter over and over again. Um, and how the circumstances he never even went into. When I started doing my investigation, I was very confused about when he was married, when he had a child. I wasn't sure, was it before the war? Was it during the war? It wasn't clear to me. So began doing some investigating, and I eventually, through a database of archived Polish records, I got hold of I should step back. Well, the first thing I found was when I did searching, I found a registration card from one of the camps he was at. And it listed his wife's name and it said underneath, two children, 2 and 4. And I think the date was 1945. It was early in 1945, the card. And I thought, oh, this doesn't seem right, and I thought it was an error, or maybe they got the information wrong. And so I was still searching for when his daughter was born, and I sent away and asked for all the records with last name Oxenhandler, which it was my father's surname. And the information came back, and I got birth registration information, and I'm sorry, marriage registration information, and I got birth registrations for 2 daughters. And I'm going, what? It was an absolute shock. And I told other family members, and everybody was just totally shocked. And I thought, well, maybe the way the circumstances was that his wife became pregnant, and then he was sent away, and he didn't even know.
Mm.
2 years ago, I went to Poland to do some more investigation, and I went to get the actual original birth registrations. And there on the bottom of the birth registrations was his signature. So he did know. But for some reason, the younger daughter, he buried the memory. And so that's the trauma operating. And
Wow.
then actually, he had no clue when his children perished, because neither, one died at 11 months, the other one was killed at 27 months. So nobody reached the age of 4. But in his mind, they were still they were still alive.
And that is the hope that you cling onto when you have nothing left. Your mind tries to create a new house of cards that fits your survival needs, that is created, in fact, by your survival needs, isn't it? We can
And
only
so I did.
imagine.
So I did eventually confirm when they were sent away to Auschwitz. I'm sure it's something my father never knew himself, nor would he ever ask.
It's very hard for us to imagine that nowadays, with the power of internet, with the power of large registries that are known, with the power of Yad Vashem and other on Simon Wiesenthal Center, there are so many Jewish institutions that are facilitating the research. But imagine that in his younger years, when maybe he wanted to have answers, There was no way like that. Everything, in the 50s, for crying out loud, there's this, and we keep forgetting that everything ended up in destroyed, really. When the Nazis, when German soldiers fled from the Russian onslaught, um, they tried to burn all the evidence. They tried to destroy as much evidence as they could. So it's
Mhm.
incredibly difficult just from that angle. But equally, there is, uh, if you look at Poland, Romania, all those areas after May 45, it was a continent in flames. Many civil wars continued, many anti-Jewish sentiments continued, because you're now a war-ravaged country. And then survivors from the camps started coming back, and you had already diminished resources. And now these bloody Jews are at it again, and now they even want their houses back. It's there's so much more going on than we sort of think. We remember the VE celebrations and those kind of things, and everyone thinks, yeah, great, 8th of May, that was the end of the World War. Well, no, it was not. The World War ended early 50s, really, in many countries because civil wars continued there, and therefore the destruction and the confusion and documents not being found. It's so much more than just a short period of 12 years from 33 to 45.
And took it took quite a number of years to settle all the refugees.
Exactly.
And uh,
Mm,
and that's why so many Jewish survivors headed towards Palestine or Israel, because
mm,
that wasn't necessarily their first choice.
mm. Exactly.
North America was, but it took several years before uh, immigration restrictions were loosened so that they could get there. And so
Mm,
many languished in refugee camps throughout Europe, mostly in Germany,
mm,
for quite a number of years. I know I have family members who were born in those refugee camps.
mm. And I think it's important that we point that out, that the Americans knew damn well what was going on in those 12 years in the German Reich. Yet they kept the quota up. What was it, 27,000 a year Jews were allowed to come into the United States? Some ridiculously low number. And that continued pretty much throughout the Second World War. So talk about
It
anti-Semitism
was,
at a,
yes, yeah, it was not loosened up until I would say in the US 47, 48,
well,
somewhere in there. In fact, American soldiers were not informed about the concentration camps. Uh, they felt that if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, the feeling was, well, if we tell the soldiers that they're there to liberate concentration camps, they might not want to fight. Like, right, it was about defeating Hitler, and you don't want to distract them by, we're there to, we're also there to free Jews. And so what happened when they arrived at the concentration camps? They were traumatized.
of course they were.
They had no clue that they existed, and they had no clue what they were. And I've spoken to people whose fathers were U.S. in the U.S. military, have never spoke about what they saw at the camps. They were so
Mm.
traumatized.
Wow. And I think I'm grateful to you that you are so open with this because especially nowadays we see so much misinformation. And I thought 70s and 80s and 90s were bad enough with Holocaust denial and weird semi how do you call that? My God, I'm lacking the words to even describe such attempts of saying, "Ah, the whole thing has never happened." But it's so much more complex. It's so much more. It's not so black and white. Germans are the baddies, Americans are the goodies. Yeah, about that. Um, if you look at the anti-Semitism and the way Hitler was celebrated within the United States, within England, all those kind of victors, when we scratch just a little bit under the surface, we see the same anti-Semitism there. Um, and certainly, um, I think I can talk freely here. I know English families who were very clear. You can even bring a black man home, but you can't bring a Jew home. And that was something that was told to women who of my age. And I think that is something that is pervasive. For anyone out there who thinks, what are these two people ranting on about? I recommend you to do a course of on anti-Semitism, which is for free with Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is a wonderful organization of Holocaust survivors, and it documents that, and it is a fantastic course. I've done it, and it opens your eyes towards the reality. And I think that is really what we need nowadays, isn't it?
And I should say, anti-Semitism is not like other forms of hate. Um, it's not race-based. Um, it is based on conspiracy theories.
True.
And like the history of anti-Semitism, it began with the belief that Jews killed Christ. And it's been one conspiracy theory after another that Jews use Christian children's blood to make
Absolutely.
their matzah unleavened bread at Passover. Jews control the banks. You know,
Well, Jews
and you
do
know,
Jews did control the banks because that was one of the few professions that were actually
right,
allowed for a Jew to have to deal with money, which was deemed to be negative. So
right.
we are blaming people for something that the only job that they could do in medieval ages. For crying out loud.
And the same thing goes with alcohol production. That it was frowned upon. And so what a surprise that so many major alcohol producers are Jewish. Same
Oh,
thing.
oh
In fact,
dear.
that was my mother's family were in the business of making booze.
Oh dear. Oh, it is. And it's so lovely that to actually hear you spelling it out and me taking the opportunity to actually talk about that, because it by us shining light onto ludicrous statements, things like that, maybe it allows also people who then think, okay, I know everything about Israel, I know everything about whatever it is currently, Gaza, Lebanon, I know it all. Maybe to re-examine their stance and re-examine their emotions and what they're being what they're being told by uh, by the media, by maybe the people around them, by certainly social media. Wow. But I mean, coming back to you, we are touching about many subjects here that are of such paramount importance because right now we see history being repeated. At the same token, though, there is this personal component there for you because your behaviors, you touched upon it, your difficulty in trusting others, um, probably your attitude towards food. I was certainly brought up by my great grandmother, and uh, my great grandmother had gone through everything, and I know nothing. I know no story. I know one story of her. That's as much as she ever told. But it was clear when we eat, and there will not be a morsel left on the plate, regardless how big that plate was, and regardless if it was burned or whatever. you will eat every single morsel because there was a time when we didn't have food. Such beliefs and such behavior has that equally. I'm going to give us some examples there.
Um, I think that was certainly a case with my mother,
Hmm,
who had quite an issue with food. She was obsessed with food, for
hmm,
one. She would go to a wedding. She would not comment on the bride's dress. She would not comment on the flowers or the music or anything, but she would run down the entire menu. That's all she would talk about. There was no food wasted in my house. Uh, my uh, my my mother would not throw anything out. If something went bad, she would still eat it. My father would bring home chickens because he worked in it early on. He worked in the chicken store, and the bird would be defeathered and the head cut off, but she would eat the neck and the feet. Um, she would suck the marrow out of bones. There
hmm,
was no waste.
hmm,
I remember one time my mother was cooking a soup, and she used to keep a box of salt on the control panel of the stove. And it fell into the pot of soup one day. And she pulled it out and scooped out as much as salt as she could. It was about the same quality as the Dead Sea. So, of course, she served it. I wouldn't eat it. And my father sits down, would salt everything. And he reached for the salt shaker, and I said, Dad, maybe you want to taste it first just to see if it needs any salt. And he goes, and he put a soup and he said, and he starts shaking and putting salt into it. So an
Okay,
interesting story.
isn't it?
Those people would eat anything.
Exactly.
Um,
Oh.
and that's kind of the what the atmosphere around the dinner table was like.
And it's important to recognize what hunger and what starvation actually does to you. My goodness, it is. We nowadays know about the power of the gut microbiome and of those kind of intrinsic systems that are all linked, and the impact of trauma onto those systems. So here we have got malnutrition for years and years, probably decades, until finally in the 50s, food became more freely available, etc. So it is such a long-standing impact of on your health that it's not surprising that then also bodies deteriorated earlier than others. Was there much disease or was there much frailty within your family? Did you notice health consequences of what had occurred?
My parents were they were tough as nails. They were quite resilient.
Hmm,
My
interesting.
father would eat anything. Well, no, that's not quite anything. He could survive on gravel, I think. Um, but the interesting thing is, he would never eat anything green. He would refer to it, he would refer to it as grass. We used to always laugh. There was one time where my wife made a zucchini cake, and he came over. He had dropped by, and she served him a tea with a piece of cake, and he asked, "Oh, nice cake. What kind of cake is this?" And I said, "Zucchini cake," and he laughed. And he thought I was joking. And then he went home, and I guess he told my mother, and she's, "Oh, probably it was." And he phones up and starts yelling at us when we tried to poison him. So, yeah, So we, it was sort of a joke in the home in our home. Well, 2 years ago, I went to Auschwitz and we were with a tour guide, and one of the group asked and we were in Birkenau, and it was like all open fields near the entrance. It was all covered in grass, and one of the people in the group asked the guide, "Was there always grass here?" And the guide said, "No, the prisoners ate the grass." And I just looked at my wife and she looked at me and we were like, oh, there you go.
I know the same story though from my grandfather, who was young and was in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, in fact, and run by the Americans. But initially, there was not much food there, and they ate grass. So this is a this is the reality of
Yeah.
warfare. And even when the war is finished, the Rheinwiesen lagers, you've had suddenly in Germany, for example, there's the River Rhine, and a beautiful summer there in 45 spring, summer. Well, that beautiful summer, suddenly they had all these German soldiers. What shall we do with them? Americans were certainly not prepared, neither the English or the French, to deal with tens of thousands of, or even more, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So they were put there into barbed wire encampments, and many of them ended up starving to death. Ended up with diseases. There was no protection from the environment. So only because a war has just finished. Again, you have to see the flow on consequences. My good. Trust, and I mean the it's hard with hindsight because you were young then, and you don't get the insights, but there will be some memories there where you can think that the behaviors, the attachment patterns of your parents were being handed down to you. Which traits of your behavior do you think are are particularly coined, are particularly influenced by the story of your parents?
Um, there are a number of things that I can point to. Um, my independence.
Mhm,
I don't like to rely on other people. Um, I don't get, I have difficulty getting close to people. I don't trust people.
mhm,
Um, I have issues with abandonment. So these are things that clearly are I've acquired either through generational trauma or as a result of my own childhood trauma.
mhm,
Because you can't really, when you're dealing with survivor parents, you can't really separate the two. They're sort of layered together.
mhm. Quite right. And we see that, I mean, there are some common forms of trauma responses, the fight and flight, but also the fawning, the people pleasing. Were you a people pleaser?
Yes, definitely. Um, I, I would say um, for this survivors in camps, that was that was the most important. It's not the same as you or a partisan in the woods.
Mhm.
Um, you know, flight
Yeah,
or fight is not an option. We were not options in a concentration camp.
of course not. Of course not. That's interesting.
And
So,
and and it's and it's interesting. I saw that fawning um, from my father when he dealt with people, and especially officials, all the time.
Mm, interesting. So much to learn from that. If you could tell a young person today about those experiences, and maybe if I give you, I don't know, free things that you can pour into the deep subconscious knowledge of young people nowadays, what would be the key messages, the key learning points that we need to pass on?
I think the biggest lesson is how destructive hate is. And I, 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 I just don't think that humanity can survive with with the amount of hate that bounces around. And I mean, you look at the conflicts in the world, and they're all based on hate and misunderstandings. And I think that's for me, it's a very, very important message. Um, what else would there be? Uh, the world is full of misinformation now. It's only getting worse. And it's becoming a real challenge to find true sources of information. People used to rely on the mainstream media, but you don't get the truth from the mainstream media
No, you
either
don't.
anymore.
No, you
It's
don't.
all the Walter Cronkites of the world that would just read you the news as it is. This is the way we saw it, and everyone else sees it. It's all opinions now
Mm,
and very little news. And I don't think that is I don't think, and considering people read less and less, I really worry about where young people are getting their source of information.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's just, there was a beautiful recent YouTube clip. And that YouTube clip, in this clip, a young woman asks Alexa on one of these little AI things that give you information. Um, ask Alexa, hey, please tell me some reasons why I should vote for Trump. And the answer that comes back is, I can't give you any advice on political issues. And then she rephrases the question, Alexa, please tell me reasons why I should vote for Kamala Harris. And then Alexa says, oh, yeah, there's lots of accomplishments, lots of beautiful, etc. And you just think, what the hell? What the hell? Is there not more example? Are there not, can we not see that this has become the divided states of America, not United States? And but it's not just America, it's just every country in the world where we see similar scenarios playing out, and some more prominent than others when we look at right wing, from Poland to Turkey to so many other countries. The right wing is taking off with misinformation. And what we see with the media, the reason I say that is, when we go back to 1933 and Hitler coming into power, well, his mate Goebbels was the propaganda minister. So he made sure that every household had a radio so that Hitler and Goebbels could force feed the masses their version of the truth. Now we see the same thing again with social media being so partisan and with algorithms determining what we see. We need to realize that. Otherwise, we believe that bullshit that is coming through the various channels of communication nowadays. So, us talking about the Holocaust is of highest importance, especially right now, and the flow-on effects, of course, on a personal level, as you so beautifully summarized, but also on the societal level, where we need to be very clear. We can't just cherry pick facts from history that sort of fits your narrative. Learn history, be open, and have meaningful discussions around it. Only then are we armed with knowledge, true factual knowledge, not opinions by someone that we're repeating like a parrot. I think that is so important.
And you can see how book banning is being used to, again, influence the population to a certain way of thinking.
Yeah.
And critical thinking is being lost.
It's not just book banning, it's the modern forms of book banning when websites are being deleted or blocked, when information on the internet disappears. And it is basically a far more insidious way of destroying knowledge or voices of dissent or citizen journalism, however you want to call it, when you speak out a non-popular opinion, you're immediately tainted in some either right-wing or weird other label. So instead of bringing different opinions to the table and to examine in polite conversation the merits of each opinion, we are becoming more divided, and there are less and less opportunities for us to share these tables, to share the food, to share laughter, and in a nice setting bring out points of content or something interesting to discuss. We are missing that. And I think I see that as a huge problem. My generation was forced to learn about the Holocaust. And I'm forever grateful to the German school system that we had an in-depth look at the German Reich, which started my own journey to of inquiry. I'm a history buff because I see it of such importance that we need to learn about the truth, not the truth that was put in a school history book. That's often enough bullshit there as well, because these books were written by the victors. I want to know the real story of the people who were living it there and then. And that is what you are doing. You have brought out this story, and this story has taught me a lot. That's beautiful. But I also want to know the side of the concentration camp guard. I want to know the side of the Polish person who was feeling threatened by the Jews. There are stories there. Let's bring those out and let's examine them and let's figure out how did they come about? Because only by us being inquisitive can we see patterns emerging that are replaying today. And I think that is so important. So thank you. You're an amazing man, Willie, that you're bringing out uh, your story so that others can learn from it. And that especially the children of Holocaust survivors nowadays can maybe make sense of it to to see why they behave, to see maybe some of the challenges and obstacles they have faced in their life that maybe were greatly influenced by the things that were passed down in the generations.
I know I've spoken to a lot of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Part of it is because of doing research on another book. And uh, it's like it's all over the map. There are those who sort of gone through the process of self-awareness, have gone for therapy and worked out their issues and figured out where they are in their life and their relationship with their parents. And there was others who have been walking around for 60, 70 years and just holding it all in, and thinking they're the only ones feeling this way. And and when I spoke to them, I tried to assure them, you're not alone.
Mm.
There's millions of us out there. And there really are. There are millions.
And I think it's important to give yourself permission to tell your own story to yourself, to actually accept that this is what has occurred. And that maybe you give yourself permission to be yourself, i.e., to be the child of a Holocaust survivor. And because of those circumstances, you are behaving the way you are, the trust issues that you mentioned, the little stories around food. There's so many more examples out there that are quite typical for or explainable. Typical is probably a wrong word. They're explainable. You suddenly, it opens your eyes to yourself, why you get triggered in a certain way, why there are certain core beliefs, etc. And maybe it allows you to re-examine your own behavior and think, okay, are these core beliefs truly serving me? Are they really there good for me? Or maybe is it time to re-examine that and maybe try to work with myself or maybe with the guidance of a coach or of a psychologist or of a counselor towards establishing new core beliefs and maybe changing ways I see the world. So it is by us opening ourselves up and being so authentic and raw as you have been with me, that is a huge thing in a society where we constantly put up masks and where we constantly portray other persona that we would like to be or we think society should be, or which are forced on us by our core belief of people pleasing. Here you are. So there's so many things. Hopefully, our interview today has helped others to get a greater insight into the flow-on effects of their ancestry.
Well, I'm on a personal journey myself, and um, I'm not where I was 5, 10 years ago.
Mm,
And one of the things that I've committed to is keeping my family story alive
mm,
and also um, making people aware about anti-Semitism. It's quite interesting how if you're not Jewish, you don't see it necessarily, or you don't see it as a big of a problem as
mm,
somebody who has it directed at them.
mm,
And so I am now quite vocal about history, anti-Semitism,
mm.
and making people aware that my family is a classic example of what happens when hate goes out of control.
Beautiful. I'm sending you all the energy you need to tackle this task over the next years because your task will become more important with the days, with each and every day passing, because there will be less and less survivors there. I was honored to interview two concentration camp survivors on my show. But I mean, these were children when they were at the camps. Uh, and now we are running out of time. Soon a
Yes.
whole generation is gone, and there are no more immediate witnesses to that. So therefore, we need to make sure that history is being taught by those that at least have a direct link to that. It's far less likely that you will change into a Holocaust denier or that you will change into being an anti-Semitic wordsmith. No, 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 no. You're an author, and you want to keep the story alive. You want to keep the history alive, and for that I
And
commend you.
that's one of the reasons why I've
Mm,
documented it as
mm.
well.
Beautiful,
And I'm going to be doing future books on these topics because it's just so important.
wonderful. Willie, if people want to know more about you, if they want to find your book, if they want to find more about you, even get in contact, how can they do that?
Um, my website is williehandler.com.
Mhm.
Um, and Willie's with a IE. And you can find my memoir, which actually is being released this week.
Oh,
Um, on Saturday is available on Amazon. It's been a top seller already for the last 6 weeks
beautiful.
because it's on pre-order. So I welcome people to check it out.
Mm,
It is a powerful piece of work.
mm.
Probably the most best thing I ever wrote.
Beautiful. Guys, look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast. All the information of Willie is down there. Please check it out and please take a moment to re-examine your own thoughts and your own emotions when you see extremism on the rise again. And it's those people around us who are quiet in the face of evil that are as much part of the problem as the evil itself. So, therefore, I think this is a time in our lives where we actually want to speak out and want to lead with being a model of thinking clearly and thinking in a sane way. There is no room for hate. There is no room for extremist opinions. We all are in need of joy, love, a hug, some beautiful food, some music, some positivity. And we can choose that. And I hope that Willie's story has placed the importance back on that in your life. So hopefully we can all make a bit more informed decision today, right now, and of course in the upcoming election in the United States, but also in many other parts. So wherever you live, there will be extremism and extremist voices. Re-examine your attitude, and you might find that you see things in a very different light. Willie, thank you so much for your time. It was an honor to have you on my show.
I know I appreciate having an opportunity to tell my story. So
Hmm,
thank you.
no trouble at all. And you guys out there, look after yourself and live with passion.
I
Bye.
never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn around.